The silence before the collapse. At 5:17 a.m. on a freezing Tuesday morning, the radios inside one American prison suddenly went silent. No alarms. No emergency response team. No correctional officers walking the tier. For the first time in decades, an entire housing unit had effectively been abandoned. Inside the block, more than 180 inmates realized something was wrong almost immediately. Breakfast never arrived. Cell doors stayed locked longer than normal. Then one inmate noticed something that should have been impossible inside a maximum security prison. The officer station was empty. According to multiple reports from correctional staff unions across the United States, understaffing inside prisons has reached crisis levels in recent years. Facilities in states like New York, Illinois, California, and Pennsylvania have repeatedly warned that mandatory overtime, staff burnout, assaults, and deteriorating working conditions were pushing officers toward a breaking point. But on this day, inside a prison unit already known for violence, tension, and staff shortages, the breaking point finally came. Because the guards didn't just complain. They walked off the unit. And for the inmates trapped behind those steel doors, the next several hours would expose something prison officials never wanted the public to see. How fragile the entire system really was. Most people imagine prisons as places of total control. Cameras everywhere. Officers on every corner. Strict routines timed down to the minute. But former correctional staff have repeatedly described something very different behind the scenes. Facilities operating with skeleton crews, exhausted officers working double shifts, and entire units being held together by routine alone. Routine is everything inside prison. Wake-up counts, meal movement, medication rounds, yard release, security checks. If even one part of that rhythm fails, the entire atmosphere changes. And inmates notice immediately. Former prisoners often describe prison as a place where survival depends on reading tiny details. A missed head count. An officer acting nervous. A delayed meal cart. These small disruptions can signal that something bigger is happening long before alarms ever sound. That morning, the signs began stacking up fast. First came the delay. Then the silence. Then came the realization that no officer had walked the upper tier in nearly 40 minutes. One inmate reportedly started banging on his cell door to test whether staff would respond. Nothing. Another shouted toward the control bubble. Still nothing. That's when panic began spreading through the block. Because prisons are built on one invisible principle above all else. Someone is always watching. The moment inmates believe nobody is watching anymore, the balance changes instantly. And according to later accounts from correctional employees familiar with the incident, the officers assigned to that housing unit had reached a point where many felt physically unsafe returning to the floor. Mandatory overtime had become normal. Some officers were allegedly working 16-hour shifts multiple times per week. Staff vacancies kept growing. Assaults on correctional officers had reportedly increased. Morale was collapsing. One veteran guard would later describe the environment with a single sentence. "We weren't managing the prison anymore. We were surviving it." That sentence terrified administrators. Because prisons rely heavily on perception. If inmates sense weakness, exhaustion, or fear among staff, authority begins to erode. And once authority starts collapsing inside a correctional environment, violence can spread faster than almost anywhere else in society. Especially in high-security housing units. Inside those units, tension is constant even on normal days. Rival groups live feet apart. Some inmates struggle with severe mental illness. Others are serving decades-long sentences with little hope of release. Small conflicts can escalate instantly. Now imagine all of that pressure inside a unit where the officers suddenly disappear. That was the nightmare scenario unfolding that morning. At first, some inmates thought it was a setup. Others thought a riot had already broken out somewhere else in the prison. Rumors started moving cell to cell. Someone got stabbed. The guards quit. There's a lockdown. No. Something worse happened. Then came the sound that changed everything. A door buzzed open. Not a full release. Just one door. But inside prison, one unlocked door at the wrong time can alter the entire balance of power. According to former correctional staff interviewed in similar incidents across the U.S., accidental or delayed door controls during staffing emergencies create some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. Inmates test boundaries immediately. Others prepare for violence before it even starts. Because nobody knows what happens next. Inside the housing unit, inmates reportedly began shouting warnings down the tier. Some demanded to be let out. Others told everyone to stay calm. A few began covering their cell windows, something correctional officers often consider a major warning sign because it prevents staff from seeing what's happening inside. But there were barely any staff left to respond anyway. And somewhere else in the prison, administrators were scrambling to contain a disaster they had feared for years. Because this wasn't just one absent officer. Multiple guards had reportedly refused to continue working the unit. Some walked out due to safety concerns. Others allegedly called supervisors saying they were physically incapable of continuing mandatory overtime after days without proper rest. One report from correctional labor groups around that time described prisons as one incident away from operational failure. Now operational failure was happening in real time. What makes situations like this especially dangerous is that prisons depend heavily on psychology rather than force alone. There are never enough officers to physically overpower hundreds of inmates at once. Control comes from structure, predictability, presence, the illusion that staff remain fully in command. But when that illusion breaks, even briefly, every inmate inside begins recalculating the situation. Who has power now? Who's vulnerable? Who's prepared? Who panics first? Former inmates often describe these moments as the most dangerous because uncertainty itself becomes combustible. Nobody trusts the rumors. Nobody knows what staff are planning. Every sound feels threatening. And then something happened that investigators would later focus on heavily. An inmate near the center tier reportedly yelled 3 words that echoed across the housing block. They left us. Not, they locked us down. Not, they're coming back. They left us. That sentence spread fear through both inmates and prison staff alike because it represented something correctional systems are designed to prevent at all costs. The perception of abandonment. Outside prison walls, most people never think about how thin the line really is between order and chaos inside these facilities. But former wardens, inspectors, and DOJ investigations have repeatedly warned that chronic understaffing creates conditions where prisons become unpredictable extremely fast. And on that morning, inside a unit already stretched beyond its limits, the system was beginning to crack open. Because while administrators struggled to regain control, and while officers argued over whether the unit was safe enough to re-enter, the inmates trapped inside had started making decisions of their own. Some wanted peace. Others saw opportunity. And somewhere inside the block, one inmate had already begun preparing for violence. When control started slipping. By 6:03 a.m., the housing unit no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a pressure cooker. Inside the cells, inmates were no longer whispering through the doors. They were shouting across tiers, trading rumors, testing reactions, trying to understand whether the prison had truly lost control, or whether something even worse was coming next. Because in prison, uncertainty is dangerous. But uncertainty mixed with fear? That's explosive. Some inmates began pacing their cells nonstop. Others stood frozen at their doors, staring into the empty corridor where officers should have been walking rounds every few minutes. The silence itself became unnerving. No radio chatter. No boots against concrete. No commands from staff. Just steel, fluorescent lights, and tension building by the second. Then another door buzzed. This time, multiple inmates heard it. Nobody knew whether it had malfunctioned or been triggered remotely during the confusion. But according to former correctional officers familiar with staffing emergencies, electronic control systems inside older prison units can become unpredictable when communication between control rooms breaks down. And now inmates were realizing something terrifying. The prison might not actually know what was happening inside the unit anymore. That realization changed the atmosphere instantly. Some prisoners started yelling for calm, warning others that tactical teams would eventually storm the block if things escalated. But others interpreted the missing staff very differently. To them this was weakness. And weakness inside prison attracts predators fast. One former inmate later described moments like these as watching gravity disappear. Rules that normally controlled behavior suddenly felt temporary. The invisible structure holding everyone in place started fading. That's when gang dynamics began surfacing. In many high-security facilities, prison gangs operate through discipline and hierarchy. Even when violence isn't happening openly, groups constantly monitor power shifts inside the institution. A staffing collapse, delayed response, or abandoned housing unit can rapidly trigger territorial behavior. Several inmates reportedly began moving messages tier to tier using improvised communication methods common in prisons. Yelling through vents, passing notes tied to strings, signaling between bars. One message kept repeating. Be ready. Nobody knew ready for what. That was the problem. Meanwhile, elsewhere inside the prison, administrators were facing a nightmare scenario spreading beyond a single housing block. Officers in neighboring units had reportedly started refusing overtime assignments too. Some staff claimed they had warned supervisors for months that exhaustion was becoming dangerous. According to correctional union complaints seen in multiple states over recent years, prisons across America have struggled with massive staffing shortages. Facilities originally designed for dozens of officers per shift were sometimes operating with only a fraction of required personnel. And when staffing numbers collapse inside prison systems, basic operations start failing one by one. Medical escorts get delayed. Cell searches stop happening. Response times slow down. Contraband increases. Tension rises. Then eventually one incident pushes everything over the edge. This was that incident. Inside the abandoned housing unit, the inmates could sense the imbalance growing stronger. Even prisoners who wanted no trouble understood the danger immediately. When authority disappears, survival often depends on aligning quickly with stronger groups or avoiding attention entirely. One inmate reportedly started praying loudly in his cell. Another demanded staff let everyone out for breakfast. Some inmates became agitated enough to begin kicking their doors repeatedly, creating a thunderous metallic echo throughout the block. Former officers sometimes call this sound pressure, when noise itself becomes a psychological weapon inside prison. Constant banging raises stress levels, spreads panic, and makes communication nearly impossible. Within minutes, the entire housing unit sounded like it was vibrating. Then came the first direct challenge. An inmate near the lower tier allegedly began shouting that officers were cowards for abandoning the block. Others joined in immediately. Insults turned into threats. Threats turned into demands. Still no officers appeared. That absence mattered. Because every minute without visible staff reinforced the same dangerous idea. Nobody was in control anymore. Prisons are built around rapid response. In normal conditions, officers intervene quickly at the first sign of instability specifically to prevent momentum from building. Once inmates believe they have psychological control over a space, restoring order becomes exponentially harder. And according to later accounts from correctional insiders, some supervisors were now debating whether sending officers back into the unit was even safe. That hesitation may have made the situation worse. Because while administrators stalled, inmates kept adapting. At approximately 6:20 a.m., according to later reports surrounding similar correctional incidents, several inmates began attempting to jam their cell doors using improvised methods. In many prisons, inmates sometimes wedge materials into door mechanisms so locks cannot fully secure. If enough doors fail simultaneously, an entire housing tier can become uncontrollable within seconds. And officers knew it. That's why emergency response teams exist. But there was another problem developing behind the scenes. There weren't enough staff available to assemble a proper extraction team quickly. Years earlier, many prisons maintained dedicated tactical units trained specifically for disturbances, riots, and hostage situations. But understaffing and budget constraints had reportedly weakened emergency readiness in some facilities across the country. Now administrators were confronting a horrifying possibility. If the unit erupted into violence, they might not have enough personnel to stop it immediately. Inside the block, inmates were beginning to sense exactly that. One former correctional officer later explained that prisoners can smell hesitation. Even subtle delays communicate vulnerability. And once inmates perceive vulnerability from staff, some begin testing limits aggressively. That testing had already started. One inmate reportedly flooded his cell intentionally. Another began smashing fixtures against the wall. Others shouted conflicting orders across the unit, making it impossible to tell who was trying to calm the situation and who wanted chaos. Then came the moment many officers later described as the true turning point. A voice from the upper tier screamed, "Open it." Seconds later, dozens of inmates began pounding on doors simultaneously. The noise became overwhelming. Steel against steel. Concrete shaking. Men screaming over one another. Some demanding release. Some warning others to stop. Some simply feeding off the fear spreading through the unit. Outside the housing block, administrators were now reportedly contacting outside agencies and emergency support personnel. Medical staff were placed on alert. Tactical gear was being prepared. Supervisors attempted to negotiate with exhausted officers refusing to return. But every delay inside prison carries consequences. And the inmates knew time was on their side. Because the longer staff stayed absent, the more power shifted psychologically toward the prisoners. Then another terrifying rumor started spreading through the unit. Someone claimed the control room had been abandoned too. Nobody could verify it. But in prison, rumors don't need to be true to become dangerous. They only need to be believable. Several inmates reportedly started preparing makeshift weapons from objects inside their cells. Others positioned themselves strategically near doors and stairwells in case locks opened unexpectedly. A few prisoners tried desperately to keep tensions from exploding, warning everyone that tactical teams would retaliate brutally if violence started. But fear was overtaking logic now. And somewhere in the confusion, one inmate managed to partially breach his cell door. Not fully open. Just enough movement to change everything. Because once other inmates saw that door shift, the entire housing unit erupted. The moment everything nearly broke. The instant that cell door shifted, the entire housing unit changed. Men who had been shouting moments earlier suddenly went quiet. Not because things were calming down. Because everyone understood exactly what that movement meant. Inside prison, a single compromised door can trigger chain reactions faster than officers can contain them. One inmate escapes confinement. Others rush to force their own doors. Rivalries ignite. Panic spreads. Staff lose visibility. And within minutes, an ordinary housing block can transform into a full-scale emergency. That was the scenario administrators had feared all morning. Now it was beginning. According to later accounts from correctional personnel familiar with similar incidents, several inmates immediately started yelling conflicting instructions across the tier. Stay back. Push the door. Don't do it. Move. Nobody was fully in control anymore. Not the inmates, not the staff, not even the prison itself. The prisoner whose door partially opened reportedly forced his shoulder into the gap repeatedly, trying to widen it. Nearby inmates began kicking their own doors harder, hoping weakened mechanisms would fail too. The sound inside the block became deafening. Metal bending. Men screaming. Boots pounding concrete somewhere beyond the unit. And then, finally, staff radios came back alive. For the first time in nearly 2 hours, inmates heard correctional officers shouting commands outside the housing block. But by then the psychological damage had already been done. Because the prisoners had seen something they were never supposed to see. The prison was vulnerable. Former wardens often describe prison authority as partly symbolic. Inmates don't obey simply because officers exist. They obey because they believe the institution can always respond faster and harder than they can. That belief keeps order intact. But once inmates witness hesitation, exhaustion, or operational failure, trust in the system weakens permanently. And according to several correctional experts who have warned about staffing crises nationwide, that erosion can take years to repair. Outside the unit, emergency response staff were now scrambling into tactical gear. Helmets, shields, chemical agents, less lethal launchers. But there was a problem. Many responding officers were exhausted too. Some had reportedly already worked extended overtime before the crisis even began. Others were entering a volatile housing unit without clear intelligence about how many inmates were preparing for violence inside. And uncertainty inside prison is deadly for everyone involved. One former tactical officer later explained that emergency entries into unstable housing blocks are among the most dangerous operations correctional staff perform. Visibility is limited. Noise distorts communication. Inmates may conceal weapons or barricade doors. Officers often enter with incomplete information while adrenaline surges on both sides. Meanwhile, inside the unit, inmates were splitting into different groups psychologically. Some wanted confrontation. Others wanted survival. And many simply wanted the nightmare to end before someone got killed. The inmate with the damaged door reportedly managed to create a wider opening before officers reached the tier. Witnesses later claimed he briefly got part of his upper body into the corridor before staff flooded the area. That moment changed the energy instantly. Because the illusion of containment had officially broken. Tactical teams entered fast. Commands echoed through the housing block. Get down. Back away from the doors. Face the wall. Chemical agents were reportedly prepared but not immediately deployed. Administrators feared triggering mass panic if inmates believed a forced extraction operation was beginning across the entire unit. Instead, officers focused first on regaining psychological control. Visibility. Noise dominance. Presence. The very things missing earlier that morning. And slowly the atmosphere began shifting again. Not peacefully, but strategically. Many inmates realized the opportunity window was closing. Tactical teams had arrived. Reinforcements were flooding surrounding corridors. Whatever uncertainty existed earlier was now hardening back into institutional force. Still, the damage could not be undone. Because inmates had now witnessed officers refusing assignments. They had seen units left understaffed. They had heard supervisors scrambling. And according to later correctional discussions surrounding staffing emergencies in multiple states, incidents like this created long-term consequences far beyond a single day. Officer morale dropped further. Inmate confidence in prison authority changed. Fear increased on both sides of the bars. That's something the public rarely understands about prisons. Correctional facilities don't just run on locks and weapons. They run on perception. Officers must believe backup will come. Inmates must believe the institution remains stable. The moment either side loses that belief, the entire environment becomes more dangerous. In the weeks following incidents like these across the United States, reports from correctional unions, inspectors, and prison administrators repeatedly pointed toward the same underlying issue: staffing collapse. Facilities designed decades earlier were struggling to operate under modern pressures. Recruitment numbers fell. Veteran officers retired early. Burnout spread rapidly. Mandatory overtime became routine. Some prisons reportedly operated with so few staff that basic movements became security risks. And when exhausted officers feel abandoned by administrators while inmates feel abandoned by the system itself, prisons become unpredictable places. That morning inside the housing unit exposed exactly how thin the line had become. But the most unsettling part came later. After the emergency response ended, after the damaged doors were repaired, after inmates were counted and the unit stabilized, investigators reportedly discovered something chilling. Several inmates had not prepared for a riot. They had prepared for survival after a collapse. Makeshift food stashes, improvised weapons, hidden water containers, quiet coordination between certain cells. Some prisoners genuinely believed the prison system might completely fail that day. That realization deeply disturbed correctional officials because it revealed how fragile confidence inside the institution had become. Not just among staff, among inmates too. Former prisoners later described the event as a moment when everyone inside briefly saw behind the curtain. The routine stopped feeling permanent. The authority stopped feeling absolute. The prison suddenly looked less like an unbreakable machine, and more like an exhausted system barely holding itself together. And maybe that's the real story. Not that guards walked off the unit, but that so many people inside already feared this day was coming. Across America, correctional experts continue warning that understaffing, burnout, violence, and deteriorating prison conditions are pushing some facilities dangerously close to operational instability. While most prisons continue functioning day after day, incidents involving staff shortages and emergency failures have raised growing concerns about long-term sustainability. Because prisons are environments where pressure never disappears. It only builds. And on that morning, inside one abandoned housing unit, the pressure finally cracked the surface long enough for everyone to glimpse what happens when control starts slipping away. The doors held. The prison survived. But the illusion never fully recovered. If you want more investigative prison documentaries revealing what really happens behind closed doors inside correctional systems around the world, subscribe now. Because the stories most people never hear are often the ones institutions work hardest to keep hidden.